Okay, so are you ready to dive deep into a case that just grabs you and won't let go?
Oh, yeah. Always up for a good, twisted story.
Right, this is the Jodi Arias case.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
It's so twisted and unbelievable, it's hard to believe it's not fiction.
Yeah, it's a case that really digs into, like, the darkest parts of human nature. It
Yeah.
really pushes what we think we know about relationships, like betrayal and the lengths people will go to cover their tracks.
It really does. You've got Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander, and their relationship was just this whirlwind of passion and drama.
Yeah, a lot of back and forth.
Yeah, and it ultimately ended in a really brutal murder.
That's right,
I
yeah.
mean, the sheer violence of it. 27 stab wounds, a slit throat, a gunshot to the head.
Yeah, it was a very violent crime scene.
It's shocking. And we're going to unpack all the evidence, the trial tactics, and Jodi's baffling behavior.
It's going to be a good one.
Yeah.
What I find so interesting from a psychological perspective is how this case really challenges our assumptions about criminal behavior. I mean, we often think of criminals as calculating and meticulous, but Jodi's actions just seem to contradict that, especially in the way the crime scene was handled. It just seems so messy.
Yeah, speaking of the crime scene, it was like something straight out of a horror movie. Travis was found decomposing in his shower, and this actually led police to initially suspect his roommates.
Oh, wow.
But they had airtight alibis.
Okay.
So then investigators found a damaged digital camera in the washing machine.
And that's where things get interesting.
Right, like who would think to look there?
Exactly.
It was like a scene from a crime procedural. The photos they recovered from that camera became crucial evidence. First, you see intimate photos of Jodi and Travis, and then glamour shots of him alive in the shower, like moments before his death.
Oh, wow.
And then a photo of Travis bloodied on the ground with Jodi's foot clearly visible in the frame. I mean, who forgets a memory card like that?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. You would think if you were trying to cover up a murder, you wouldn't leave such an obvious piece of evidence behind. I mean, it seems almost too careless.
It really does.
So this raises some interesting questions about criminal psychology. I mean, it's possible that this seemingly obvious oversight wasn't an oversight at all.
Right.
Maybe there was an element of subconscious self-sabotage there, like a hidden desire to get caught. Or it could even be a sign of overconfidence, like a belief that she could outsmart the investigators.
It's so strange. And then there's Jodi's call to the police after Travis's body is discovered. She acts concerned, wanting to help with the investigation. It makes you wonder, do criminals really think those kinds of tactics work?
Surprisingly, yes, sometimes they do. It's a phenomenon known as duping delight. It's basically this sense of satisfaction that some people get from deceiving others.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so for some individuals, inserting themselves into the investigation can be a way to control the narrative, to kind of manipulate perceptions and even experience a thrill from the deception itself. And there are actually a lot of documented cases where criminals have contacted the police believing they could outsmart them.
So it's a power play, like a way of feeling in control.
Exactly. But in Jodi's case, it backfired. Big time.
Oh, absolutely. The investigator starts the interview seemingly casual, like a friendly chat, but as he reveals each piece of contradicting evidence, her story starts to crumble. You can see him carefully analyzing every word.
Yeah, this is where the investigator's training and experience really come into play. It's a delicate dance of building rapport, gaining the suspect's trust, and then methodically dismantling their fabricated narrative, like slowly breaking it down.
Yeah, like a game of chess. It's fascinating to see how Jodi tries to explain away every inconsistency. When confronted with those incriminating photos, she says, "Well, that looks like me," as if there's even a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah,
It's almost comical, but at the same time incredibly chilling.
right. It really is. And that kind of response is particularly interesting because it could be a form of denial, a psychological defense mechanism to protect oneself from the overwhelming reality of the situation.
Right.
Or it could be a deliberate attempt to just sow doubt, hoping to create ambiguity, to raise reasonable doubt in the minds of a jury.
It's just so bizarre. And then there's Jodi's behavior when left alone during the interview. I mean, who does headstands and sings "Oh Holy Night" when they're a suspect in a murder investigation?
I know, it's almost surreal. It really is.
Like what?
This is where the case takes a really perplexing turn, because this seemingly bizarre behavior could be interpreted in a number of ways. It could be a manifestation of extreme stress, a way of coping with the immense pressure of the interrogation.
Like their mind is trying to process this horrific event, but it just short circuits?
Precisely.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, we also have to consider her apparent narcissism, which you mentioned earlier. It's possible that she was acutely aware of the cameras and consciously or subconsciously using these actions to manipulate public perception, to project an image of instability or innocence.
It's fascinating. It's almost like she's creating a persona for the cameras, playing a role.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can't always take behavior at face value, especially in high-stakes situations like this. There's often this complex interplay of psychological factors at play.
And let's not forget her fixation on her appearance, wanting to clean up for her mugshot and asking about her hair. It's such a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation.
Yeah, it adds another layer of complexity to Jodi's psychological profile, because it really highlights the potential disconnect between her internal experience and the external perception of her actions.
Almost like she's trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, even in the face of extraordinary circumstances.
That's a really good point. And it leads us to the next chapter of this story, the trial itself, where Jodi's carefully crafted persona is put to the ultimate test.
So the trial, huh? It's amazing how this case just keeps unfolding. I mean, we've covered so much already, but the trial itself is where things really take a turn into the surreal.
Yeah, trials are always fascinating because they become this intersection of law, psychology, and public perception.
Yeah.
And in a case like this, where the media attention was so intense, that dynamic is amplified tenfold.
Absolutely. And speaking of public perception, remember how Jodi was initially portrayed in the media? Like she was this blonde bombshell, this femme fatale.
Oh, yeah.
But then she shows up in court looking completely different. Glasses, subdued hair, conservative clothing. It's like a total transformation.
Yeah, this type of image makeover is a common tactic. I mean, defense teams use it, especially in high-profile cases. It's an attempt to influence the jury perception,
Right.
to create a sense of sympathy or even downplay the defendant's attractiveness, which can sometimes be seen as manipulative.
It's so strategic, like
Yeah.
playing into those deep-seated societal biases.
Exactly. The goal is to present the defendant in a way that aligns with a more favorable narrative. In Jodi's case, they may have been aiming for a more relatable, less threatening image.
It's fascinating how visuals can play such a powerful role in shaping our perceptions. But it's not just about the makeover. Jodi's story itself kept changing throughout the investigation. First, she claimed she wasn't even in Arizona. Then she said she was there but didn't witness the murder. And then finally she landed on the self-defense claim.
Yeah. This constantly shifting narrative is a key element of this case, and it really raises some important questions, like why would someone change their story so many times? Is it a sign of guilt, a desperate attempt to cover their tracks, or could it be something else?
Yeah, maybe a combination of factors. Under that kind of pressure, it's hard to imagine thinking clearly.
Yeah, that's a valid point. We have to consider the immense psychological stress of being a murder suspect. But we also have to examine the legal strategy at play.
Okay.
The defense ultimately chose to go with the self-defense claim, despite the overwhelming evidence against her, which it seems like a long shot given the brutality of the crime.
I mean, with 27 stab wounds, it's hard to imagine any jury believing that was purely self-defense.
Exactly. It raises the question of what the defense's goal was. Remember, the prosecution was seeking the death penalty.
Right.
So by claiming self-defense, the defense may have been hoping to avoid that outcome, even if a conviction was inevitable.
So it becomes a question of damage control, like mitigating the potential consequences.
Precisely. And to support their claim, the defense tried to paint a picture of Travis as having a dark side. They brought up allegations of abusive behavior from previous girlfriends and even hinted at possible pedophilic tendencies.
So they were trying to create a narrative where Jodi felt genuinely threatened, which would justify her actions.
Yes, and that's where things get legally and ethically complex. Like, how much can you scrutinize the victim's character in a murder trial? Where's the line between presenting a defense and potentially smearing the reputation of someone who can no longer defend themselves?
It's a delicate balance, for sure. But even with those allegations, the intruder theory seems far-fetched. And the level of violence is just so extreme. It's hard to reconcile that with a claim of self-defense.
Yeah, you've hit on a crucial legal point. To successfully argue self-defense, the defendant must demonstrate that they reasonably feared for their life and that the force used was proportional to the threat.
Right.
In this case, the sheer number of stab wounds makes it extremely difficult to convince a jury that the force used was necessary for self-preservation.
Yeah. It's like the prosecution said, even if you believe Jodi felt threatened, 27 stab wounds go way beyond what's considered reasonable or necessary for self-defense.
Right. That's a very powerful argument, and it highlights the challenge that the defense was facing. They had to somehow bridge the gap between the evidence and their client's claim, and that's a very difficult task.
And then there's that whole media circus surrounding the trial. It was broadcast live, and Jodi just seemed to thrive on the attention. Remember that interview she gave right after being convicted and her initial statement that she preferred the death penalty?
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It's almost like she was putting on a performance for the cameras.
Yeah, her consistent engagement with the media is one of the most intriguing aspects of this case. Makes you wonder what her motivations were. Was it a genuine need for attention, a distorted attempt to control her narrative, or something else entirely?
It's almost impossible to know for sure, but it adds another layer of complexity to an already mind-boggling case.
It reminds us that even in the age of 247 news and social media, the human psyche remains an enigma.
And this case is a perfect example of that. We've talked about the crime, the trial, the psychology, the media frenzy, but even with all of that, there are still so many unanswered questions, like what ultimately drove Jodi to commit such a horrific act?
Yeah, that's the question that haunts this case.
Yeah.
Was it jealousy, rage, a desire for revenge, or a combination of these factors? The human heart can be a dark and complex place, and the Jodi Arias case offers a chilling glimpse into that darkness.
And that's what makes this case so captivating, right? It forces us to confront the uncomfortable realities of human nature, like to grapple with the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface.
Exactly, and it also underscores the limitations of our legal system.
Right.
Even with a guilty verdict, we may never fully understand the motives behind such a heinous crime.
It's a sobering thought. We strive for justice, for answers, but sometimes the truth remains elusive. It's really hard to wrap your head around someone being so calculated, but also so reckless at the same time, you know?
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like this weird duality. And that's exactly what makes this case so fascinating. It challenges how we think a guilty person should act, how they should present themselves.
And the way she interacted with the media throughout the trial just adds to that whole puzzle. Like, remember that interview she gave right after being convicted? She initially said she preferred the death penalty.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost inconceivable, right?
Yeah, the statement really surprised everyone. It's possible she was trying to, project strength and defiance. Or maybe she was genuinely overwhelmed and just seeking a fast resolution. Who knows?
But then she changes her mind and asks for life in prison so she can supposedly help domestic abuse victims. She even brings out that survivor t-shirt again.
Right.
It's like she's completely disconnected from reality.
Her shifting stance on her punishment and that T-shirt really underscored just how complex her psychology is.
Yeah.
It raises questions about, if her remorse is even genuine. And you know what her motivations are for wanting to help others.
Do you think it's possible for someone who committed such a brutal crime to genuinely want to help others? Or is it more likely a manipulative tactic to try and get sympathy?
It's a tough question to answer for sure. We have to consider that maybe she is experiencing real remorse. But it's also possible that her desire to help others is really about self-redemption, a way to deal with her own guilt and kind of reshape her public image.
It's almost like she's trying to create a narrative where she's the victim.
Yeah, that's a good point. Throughout this whole thing, Jodi has shown this amazing ability to manipulate how people see her and craft her own narrative.
So where is she now? What's become of her? Is she still doing interviews and stuff?
As of today, Jodi is serving life in prison in Arizona. She works as a library aide. The media frenzy around her has died down. She's not the focus of attention she used to crave.
It's interesting how that worked out. You know, for someone who seemed to love the spotlight, not having that attention might be the worst punishment of all.
It really makes you think about how justice works. Sometimes the biggest punishment is losing something you really want.
This case has been a wild ride. We went from the crime scene to the courtroom, explored all these psychological theories, and unpacked the media circus. And even with the guilty verdict and the life sentence, this case still leaves us with more questions than answers.
I think that's the power of these deep dives. We go beyond the headlines to see how complex people really are. And even though we don't always find those clear answers, the journey is so insightful.
It's definitely been eye-opening. Thanks for taking us through this crazy case.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. If you were on that jury, could you have decided Jodi Arias' fate?